Gonna build a shitty wiki today. Hey guys, welcome back. So on our last episode, we created the authentication and authorization framework for our wiki, and today we're going to be connecting it up to Active Directory. And tomorrow we're going to be connecting it up to the backend internal database, because not everyone uses Active Directory. But I think we're going to do Active Directory first because it's a nice way to have something to authenticate with without having to have a data repository in our database to store these user accounts or whatever. So we're going to do that, but first I'm going to fix a couple errors that I made in the last episode. Not so much errors, but things I want to fix. If we go to our auth class, one thing that I did was I'm calling sign out async and sign in async without awaiting them, which, as you saw, works perfectly fine. The problem is that if either of these functions actually throws an exception, we're never going to see the actual result of it. So I'm going to change these from voids to async tasks and go ahead and await them so that it's not fire and forget. Whoa. Oops, I put the await in the wrong place. So we're going to await there. And then same thing here, async task. And we're going to await that, which means that in our logout page, we need to await the logout. And in our oh, this now needs to be async. And then in our auth page, this now needs to be async, and then this needs to be awaited. Okay, cool. So let's just go ahead and make sure everything still works the same way that it did, which it should. Happy birthday, 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 4 5 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3. Always takes the longest the first time. So we're gonna go ahead and log in. My name's Bob. I'm an admin. Hey, I got logged in. Still logged in. Log out. I've been logged out. I'm still logged out. Perfect. Great. All right. So another thing we neglected to do is to make our authentication page pretty. So we're going to go ahead and put some div class form groups around this stuff. We're going to have a username. We're not going to have this role thing anymore. I'm going to go ahead and delete that in a second. Let's go ahead and create a label. And let's go ahead and create another form group with a label password, and this is going to be a password field, which means you can't see the text as you're typing it in, which is good for me because I'm going to be using my real password in this episode. And this should also have the class button primary. Now, one thing I want to create that we haven't really gotten into yet is I'm going to create an alert. Bootstrap calls it an alert. Basically, it's just a status message. So, like, you know, in our first episode, we went over validation, so you can tie back a validation error to each individual control. But I want to show you how to make an overall result for the page. And typically you would do that by doing div class equals alert, and then there's like all these types like success or warning. There's no error is under danger. But instead of having to do this on every single page, because there's going to be a lot of pages that result in some status message, we're going to create what's called a view component. And that's going to basically means that we can reuse this functionality over and over again. So under my shared folder, I'm going to create a folder called components. And I'm going to do this in a completely different way than everyone else because I really don't like the way, well, for two reasons. Number one, I really don't like the way that ASP.NET Core likes to do it, which is to put every component into its own folder with a class file for the view component and then a default view for the view. So I'm actually just going to go right under here and create a razor page, and I'm going to call the page alert. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to modify this so that it is not actually a page anymore. So I'm going to go into the view here, and I'm going to remove the at page there, and I'm also going to remove this crap. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in here, and instead of inheriting from page model, I'm going to inherit from ViewComponents. And I'm going to get rid of this onGet, and I'm going to create a, I believe this is a iViewComponent result called invoke. And this is going to create a view component. So what is a view component? A view component is just a reusable piece of HTML code with C# code behind that you can reuse into your views, pass them parameters, get a result back without having to basically put it in every time. This is not the same thing as a Blazor component, or it's actually called a Razor component. A Razor component is part of Blazor, which is a client side or server side, but changes piped to the client side framework that makes pages extremely responsive, but they have to be they either have to be running completely in WebASM, or they have to be connected with an always-on WebSockets connection to the server. It's completely beyond the scope of this tutorial. I just wanted to set the record straight. This is not a Razor component. This is a Razor Pages view component. So in our view, I'm going to go ahead and type in the template that I actually want to create here. So basically it looks like this: div class equals alert, and then there's going to be, we're going to have one of many different, as you can see, you can select multiple different types of alert, but instead of having to hard code it, I'm going to do model.className. Actually, I can just do model.class because it's an uppercase C, and then in the div is going to be our model.text, and I'm going to say if not string null or empty model.text, then display this. That way, if there's nothing to display, we don't actually display it, and that way the view component can be on our page at all times. You'll see what I mean in a bit. Now, ignore these errors right here. Actually, this is going to be capital M. Ignore these errors right here real quick. I'm going to go into the code behind and change a couple things. For starters, this is just going to be called alert, and I am going to create a class called alert model, which is going to contain the two properties that we're going to use here. So text, which is going to be the text that the alert contains, and oh my god, I cannot type today, and class, which is the CSS class name for this type of alert. And then if I go back here, it should all be happy because the model is alert model. And if I go into my code behind now, I keep calling it code behind. I know it's not really called code behind anymore, but I'm going to keep calling it that. So, fuck you. This invoke method here is going to take it's going to take a string parameter, and it's going to take a class name parameter. And it's going to be very simple. We're just going to say return view, and I'm going to provide an absolute path to the view, and I'll explain why in a second. And then we're going to create a new alert model where the text is the text and the class is the class name. Autocomplete would be great if it worked. And I'm going to actually hard code in the absolute path components alert.cshtml. And this is kind of shitty because if I move this around, I mean, technically you're never going to move it around because all your components by design have to live in this components folder. But the reason why I'm hard coding the view path is because I'm going to have multiple view components that use the same exact view. And normally in ASP.NET Core, you would have to create a folder under components. Like I'd have to have a folder called alert. I'd have to have a folder called error, a folder called success, a folder called warning. And I don't want to sit here and create. It would literally be 8 different files I would have to create right now to get the same effect. And I really don't want to do that. Instead, what I want to do is I just want to be able to duplicate this class and say, okay, well now I want to create an info alert. And I no longer need the class name because I know that the class name is going to be alert info. And likewise, I'm also going to create 4 of these, and they're going to be info warning error, which uses the danger class. Danger! Watch yourself! And success. So that should be all we need to do there. And then the other thing I'm going to do is there's this file that we haven't talked about yet called view imports. And if I go in here, this is used for all the views, and it sets some things up. It includes the shitty wiki namespace, which is why I don't have to ever include the shitty wiki namespace. It sets the namespace of all my views to shittywiki.pages, which is why our auth page, which is called auth, doesn't conflict with the auth class that we created, because they're in 2 different namespaces. But it adds these tag helpers, and we went over what some tag helpers were in episode 1 and 2, but I'm also going to add our own tag helpers from the shitty wiki namespace, and that's going to tell ASP.NET Core that when I look for a view component, that it should look in all the classes that are in my I'm sorry, I don't mean namespace, I mean assembly. So whenever I compile something into this assembly that inherits view component, it's going to be part of that. So let me go ahead and show you how we use this stuff. I'm going to go to my auth page here, and there's a couple errors I have to resolve real quick because I didn't create a password field. So let's go ahead and create the password field. And what's this other error in there? Okay, good. Now we don't have any errors. So if I go to the view here, I'm going to go up here. I'm just going to create a couple examples. I'm going to say VC error. I'm just going to say hi. And I'm going to create a couple of them. Info, success, and warning. And if I do, that should be it. They're not turning green, but I don't care. It'll probably work. Maybe not. Let's see. Let's see what I did wrong. Watch yourself. La 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 la. Log in. Oh, there we go. That all worked. So you can see how I can just create. I can just put that tag in there and fill it in. I don't have to do any of that. And it's not only just like including HTML. It's also running the whole view model framework. So I could, you know, have logic in there to do all kinds of things if I wanted to. In fact, I just remembered that I forgot one thing. I'm actually going to go back in here to the alert view, and I'm going to add this html.raw. The reason I'm adding this is because it's very likely that we're going to want to put markup in those boxes, whether it be images or just line breaks. And if I don't put this here, any HTML that I spit into this text parameter is going to get escaped, and it's just going to show up on the screen instead of actually being rendered by the browser. So that's why I have to do that. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create an extensions class for some extension methods, because there's one thing I want to create real quick. So we're going to call this, it's going to be public static class wiki extensions. And I'm going to create an extension method in here, which is like a method you can use pretty much on an object, on a class you didn't create. So I'm going to say public static string get errors. And what this extension method is going to do is it's going to operate on the model state, and it's going to give me back a nice list of all the errors. So again, in episode 1 you saw that if I didn't fill in the I mean, in this case it's the username and password field. If I didn't fill in the username field, there'd be like a little tiny error under the username field saying, you know, you didn't put something in here. Well, if I just want a summary of all the errors on the page, and I don't want to sit there and position it next to each input, you know, control, this is going to be a function that gets that for me. So this is actually going to operate on the model state dictionary object, which is the model state. It's the same thing that you saw me use earlier where I said, you know, is model state is valid or not or whatever. And this operator, this keyword here is part of the extension method syntax. Essentially means that in any page I'm going to be able to say model state.get errors and actually get a list of all the errors. So how this is going to work is we're going to return string.join, which combines an array, and we're going to separate the elements in the array with a line break. And we're going to say model state.values, but this is not a list of strings, so we have to do select many, and for each one we have to get the errors, and then we have to do select, and then for each one of those we have to get the error message. So this is going to give us a nice string return value with all of the errors each on their own line. And that way, in my auth page, which is up here, I can say if the model state is invalid, not only are you going to wind up on the same page, but we're going to set the error to model state.get errors. And error is something I'm going to create right now. Public string error. Woo. And now we have a use case to use our beautiful error view component. Now let's give that a try and make sure we didn't break anything. Tra-la-la, tra-la-la. Go ahead and log in, just hit the button, boom, there we go. The role field is required. I have to delete that from the back end. And also our shit is not on, it's not pretty. It's not pretty, it's not a pretty shitty wiki. Why is that? Oh, because I need to add the form control class to these. I don't know why Bootstrap needs to be told that a control is a control or that a table is a table, but it is, so, and it does, so it has to be told for whatever reason. What did I just do? Role does not exist. Oh yeah, we have to, let's just comment this out because just get rid of it for now. But now it's gonna get upset that I don't have that. Yeah, so whatever. It'll be fun till daddy takes Active Directory away. There we go. It looks much better and beautiful. They turn red, you get some errors. Awesome. And the reason why I put this box up here is because we're going to have tons of errors that can come back from the authentication handlers that we're going to use. So it's important to have a place where we can put an error where it's not associated with one field or another. Alright, so another function I'm going to write real quick. Extension method that I typically add to any project is the dump command. It's the button that they press when Howard Stern says objectionable things. Like this object here, it's pretty objectionable. No, it actually is just going to take any object and convert it into JSON so that we can make troubleshooting super easy. So I'll be able to do pretty much anything .dump now and get a blob of JSON that represents it. Why is this still upset? Excuse me? Oh, it's not inside the class. That's wacky. Alright, now let's discuss the authentication framework we want to build. So I'm going to go into my app settings.json file. And one thing that's always really handy to do is when you're building an application, I like to create the configuration file that I ultimately want to have and then write all the code that actually makes use of that configuration file. So I want to think up all the features that I want my product to have, and I want to figure out what the configuration file or the user experience or the command line architecture is going to be first, and then I actually write everything to make that actually work. So this is no different. I'm going to create a section here called Authentication, and in here's where we're going to put our authentication settings. So we're gonna be able to select multiple authentication providers. So we're gonna have an array that's gonna tell the wiki what types of authentication we're gonna use, what type of authentication we're gonna allow. And ultimately we're gonna have internal authentication, which means an internal to our database. Users register accounts, those accounts go in our database. They have a password, the hash is stored in our database. Everything is internal to the wiki itself. But then I also want to be able to have like Active Directory domains. And because I want this to be a good enterprise product, and a decent enterprise product has the capability of communicating with multiple Active Directory domains, because many businesses use multiple domains. It's just a nice thing to have. If you can authenticate to one, you can authenticate to multiple. So I'm going to use my internal domain, not derms, and we're going to put other here as our second domain that we're going to test. And then there's going to be two configurations that administrators are going to be able to use. Selectable true means that on the login page there's going to be a drop-down menu that allows them to choose which domain or which authentication they want to use. So they'll have username, password, and domain. Or they could do selectable false, which means that we're just going to go through every authentication provider in order and try to authenticate the user. And only if they can't log into any of them are we going to give them an error. The reason why you might want to do this is for two reasons. Number one, in a business where you have multiple domains, you might not care, you might not want the user to have to select which domain they're in. You just might want them to put their username and password in and just authenticate them and figure out which domain they're actually in. The other reason is that you often want to do AD authentication most of the time for most of your users, but you want to fall back to internal authentication if, like, for example, AD is down and you as the administrator need to be able to get in and, change the AD settings or whatever. So either way, these are the two options we're going to provide to administrators. And then we're going to have a chunk of the configuration where we're actually going to configure our providers, our authentication providers, our connections to AD in this case. Now later on, we're probably going to add like Facebook and Google authentication and all kinds of other providers that use like Auth or whatever. But today we're just going to focus specifically on Active Directory. We're going to get into internal authentication on the next episode. So if you're looking for me to do ASP.NET Core Identity, that's going to be in the next video. So for each domain, we're going to have a chunk in here. And there's a couple pieces of information we need to know in order to authenticate to Active Directory. The first one's going to be the host name of where we want to connect. So we can put in a host name or an IP address. I want to put an IP address for now. Second one is going to be a port number. This is either going to be 389 or 636. In production, you would typically use 636 because it forces TLS. 389 may also use TLS. In this debugging and diagnostic environment, I'm going to use 389. And then there's what's called a base distinguished name, which is the root of the directory structure that you want to search for users in. So we're going to populate that. And then we're going to have an option here called nested groups. And I'll explain what this does in a minute. Let's just say false. And then we're going to have a group role mappings object, which maps groups in Active Directory to roles within our wiki. So it's unrealistic to tell an Active Directory administrator to create a group called admin or guest or editor, because that group is named globally. And you may have multiple applications in your business, and admin for what? Admin for the wiki, admin for the exchange, admin for the payroll. So typically in Active Directory, group names look something like application name and then role, so like wiki admins. And we're going to map that to the admin role in our application. We might have a group called wiki editors, which we're going to map to editor. So these basically map groups in Active Directory to roles in our application. So this is what your typical Active Directory configuration looks like for any decent enterprise app. Oh, I fucked this up and didn't put a colon there. There we go. And I'm actually going to clone this and use the same exact configuration for the other domain. It's going to be the same exact server. Here, I'll make it slightly different. I'll scope it to a specific container, and I'll say that we are doing nested groups. What nested groups means is that if it, you can put a group inside of a group inside of a group. So I might want to take the entire sales department and stick them into the wiki editors group. But the lookup for that, when you look that up in Active Directory to see how many groups someone is nested inside of nested inside of nested inside of whatever, it takes longer. So unless your organization is explicitly doing this and they'll know, you typically want to leave this off because it makes login significantly faster. But we're going to create two instances of the same domain here, one with it off, one with it on, just to diagnose it, just to debug it, just to see if there's any difference. I mean, my domain's pretty small, so there won't be. And that's pretty much it for our settings here. So if you're curious how we're going to actually read all of this into the wiki, it's actually pretty simple. So let's cut over to that now. All right, so in our auth class, we're going to go back through and change these functions quite a bit, because we're going to generalize them so that they are basically usable by any authentication plugin that we might add. But we're going to create a couple things here. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to create something called AD configuration. And this is just going to be a class that holds the configuration parameters for a single domain. So in here we're going to have a public string called hostname. I'm going to copy this a bunch of times. We're going to say int port, and we'll give it a default in case someone doesn't populate it. We're also going to have base DN, which can't have a default because it's going to be different on every domain. We're also going to have nested groups, which is a Boolean. And then we're going to have those mappings. So we're going to have a dictionary of string to strings that is called, what did I call it? Group role mappings. And this is going to represent each of our Active Directory domains. And then we're going to have another class called Auth config, which is going to represent the top level authentication settings. Actually, I'm going to call this Authentication config. And this is going to have our array of providers. So not only which providers we're allowing users to use, but what order we want them not only listed in if there's a drop-down menu, or tried in if we're not going to have the drop-down menu. And we're going to have a bool for selectable, which is going to determine if there's a drop-down menu or not. And then we're going to have a dictionary of string to AD configuration pairs called domains. All right. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to create a class called auth result. And this is going to be a generic response that comes back from authentication, no matter what is being used to authenticate the user. So in here, we're going to have all kinds of properties that we're going to want to make use of. The first one's going to be success, or Boolean, success. So this is going to determine whether or not the user properly authenticated. We're going to have a string for an error message if they have not properly authenticated. We're going to want, actually, hold on, I'm going to copy this a bunch of times. We're going to want their proper username. Even though the username typed their username into the box, it might have different capitalization than what it actually is. So we want to get back their real username. Also, maybe they might be authenticating with an email address or something, so we might need the username to come back from the directory. We want their email address. We want to know the authentication type, because this is going to get used for different types of authentication. We're also going to want their display name. Their username might be different from the name that we want to show, so we're going to have a display name. Distinguish name, which is kind of like the path to where they are in Active Directory. Title, which might be useful in an enterprise environment. And we're going to have an array of roles, which is going to determine what role claims we assign to the user: admin, user, editor, moderator, band, whatever we need to put in there. And I'm going to go ahead and create two constructors. I'm going to create an empty constructor, and I'm also going to take a constructor that takes an error message, so that it makes it really easy to populate the error message when we're returning error situations here. All right, so with that out of the way, I'm going to go back and modify our login function to be generic. So we're still going to take an HTTP context, but instead we're also going to take an authorization result. So let me annotate this real quick. Applies a successfully logged in user to their current HTTP session. So this doesn't actually authenticate the user, this just logs them in once they're actually authenticated. So I'm just gonna just gonna reference the items that we have in auth result and add them to the claims. So they're always gonna have a username and they're always gonna have an IP address, but the rest of them they may not have. So if they have a DN, we're going to add that. And then I'm going to copy this a bunch of times and do the same thing for email and title and display name. And then we're always going to give them the user role. And then we're going to say for each R in r.roles, we're going to add that. Why is that not a thing? It does contain a definition for roles. I remember typing it. Oh, mistype. So that should work. Can't use the letter R because I'm already using it for the auth result. So we're going to do that. The auth type is going to be r.auth type. And I think that's all we need for that. And I misspelled that. There we go. All right, so that is now genericized. And I'm going to go back to our auth page. Actually, I'm not going to go back to our auth page yet. Now let's talk about dependency injection because we're going to use it in a second. So if you remember back in some of these pages, I created a constructor and I made passing in a database reference mandatory. And you might have been thinking, well, hey, how is this constructor getting used? I mean, we never actually create something called page model. And if this is getting called by the ASP.NET Engine, how does it know what the fuck a database is and how to create it? Well, if you remember, back in our startup class, when we first started, we added a service called addDBContext of database. And this basically tells ASP.NET Core how to construct this type of object. And there's within this addDBContext function behind the scenes, it's adding what's called a scoped dependency to the services container. What that essentially means is that it knows that anytime it needs to create something and it requires a database as a parameter to either a constructor or to like a method invocation, whatever, it knows that it needs to create one. There's a couple different types of service dependency. There's singletons, which only get created once per application. There's scoped dependencies like database, so a new database reference, a new database context or connection is created for every unique page transaction. So services is basically a container that contains all of these references to all of the things we need so that they can be injected as we need them. So we're going to actually create a service right now, and the pattern for that is to start off with an interface. So we're going to create an interface called iAuthResolver. And what our authentication resolver is going to do is it's going to figure out not only what types of authentication providers there are, whether it be AD or internal or Facebook or whatever, and tell the login page how to present them, but it's also going to be the thing that accepts the username and password and the selected domain and figures out how to authenticate the user. So what we're gonna have two required members for an iAuth resolver. The first one is going to be a function that returns a list of strings called getDomainList. And this is what's going to be used to figure out what options should be shown to the user. And the other one is going to return an auth result, and it's going to be called Authenticate. And it's going to accept a domain, a username, and a password. Except that it's going to need to be async, so this is going to need to actually return a task of auth result. I'll probably make a different video on async await and how all that works. There's a million of them out there on YouTube, so I probably don't need to make a video. But so the idea is we create an interface, and then we create the implementation of that interface. So we say public class auth resolver implements iAuth resolver. Oops, implements iAuth resolver. And we can go ahead and implement this. So you might be saying, well, why would you do that? Why don't you just use auth resolver? You know, just like you did database for the database context. You didn't create an I database first. Well, this is good practice. The reason this is good practice is so that the people that use your service make a reference to iAuth resolver, and that way there's two reasons why you'd want to do that. The first is that if I ever need to change auth resolver and add things to it or change things, I can do that and have iAuth resolver get implemented by multiple classes. Auth resolver doesn't have to be the only iAuth resolver there is. Someone can come in and create a new auth resolver that has functionality that I didn't even think about. And the other reason why you might want to do this is for unit testing. For example, it's really hard to unit test the authentication piece because you're going to have like accounts and databases and directories and all this other shit. So you might want to create like a testing auth resolver that just like returns true all the time, so that when you do unit testing, you don't have to actually, you know, make calls into your enterprise's Active Directory or whatever the fuck. So that's why you kind of separate out the implementation from the interface. Now we're going to want to register this as a service. So we're going to go back to our startup. Boop, 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 boop. And in here somewhere, whoa, what the fuck was that? Services.addScoped. And this is going to take two types. One of them is the actual type. It's called the service type. So we're going to say iAuth resolver. And the other one is the implementation type, the one that we want ASP.NET to actually inject, which is the auth resolver itself. All right. So now I could, in any of my constructors on any of my pages or page filters or anything that uses ASP.NET Core, I could basically just require an iAuth resolver, and it will create one for me or for the user or for whoever the fuck. So let's go back here. And there's a couple things that we're going to need to have in order to do authentication properly. The first one is we're going to need an HTTP context, because we're going to need to be able to sign the user in, sign the user out. We're going to want their IP address. We're going to want all that other shit. And the other thing that we're going to need is an I configuration. And we're going to call that the config. Because remember, we put all of our settings in the configuration, so we got to be able to get them somehow. And while we're here, we also should create, actually, I don't know why these are public. Let's make them private. And we're also going to want an authentication config so that we can store the authentication configuration that we've actually loaded from the disk. Let's go ahead and import this namespace. And let's go ahead and create a constructor. And we're going to inject into our constructor. We're going to need, first of all, we need the HTTP context. So how do we get that? Well, there's a service called iHTTP context accessor. I'm just going to call it HCA for short. And we're also going to get a configuration reference. So in our constructor, we're going to say the context is the HCA.HTTP context. This is going to be the context of whatever page request is associated with this auth resolver, because there'll be one every time someone tries to authenticate. And we're going to hold a reference to our configuration. And then we're going to actually load our configuration. And here's how we do that. We don't have to parse any JSON. We don't have to do anything crazy. We just do get section authentication, because remember, we put it in the authentication section. And then we can just do .get of authentication config, which tells it what type we want to shove it in, and it pretty much does all the heavy lifting. Not only will it parse out the provider and the selectable, but it'll actually parse out this entire dictionary of domains. It'll turn each of these domains into an AD configuration object. It'll fill in all of these. If someone doesn't put the port number, we had a default on that property, so it'll fill in to the default. So that basically does exactly what we want it to do. All right, so let's implement get domain list. So the first thing is that if our auth config doesn't allow selectable domains, then there is no domain list. So we're just going to return null in that case, which means don't draw a drop-down box for domains. And then we're just going to say return auth config dot providers, because again, that's an array of strings that is going to be used to fill in that drop-down list. It's going to have references to all the domains that we want, and it's going to be ordered in the order that the administrator wants it in. So that was a pretty easy function. Let's get to the function that is not so easy, which is authenticate. So before we get into the nitty-gritty, well, actually, first of all, let's make this async. Before we get into the nitty-gritty, let's just stub this out and return a new auth result and just say we didn't write it yet. And let's go back and plumb in our authentication page. So I think our view is fine. Actually, no, our view is not fine. We have to create the drop-down menu. So let's go over here. Bum, 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 bum. And in our constructor, which doesn't exist, let's create a constructor. We're going to inject our auth resolver, and we're going to call it auth resolver. And we're going to create a private reference to that. Auth resolver, and we're going to capture a reference. Auth resolver equals lowercase auth resolver. And then let's go ahead and create a public string array domain list. Actually, it can be read-only because it's never going to change. And the domain list, we're going to grab that from our auth resolver. We're going to say get domain list. And then we're also going to create a property bound string called domain. So if the drop-down list is there, this is where we're going to grab the domain that the user selected. So now we're going to say if domain list is not null, then we're going to draw our domain list. So we're going to want a form group. We're going to want a label. And we're going to want a selection control. So we're going to say ASP4 domain. And in that selection control, there's going to be, what is the issue? Oh, model. I forgot the word model. We're going to have an option for every domain that's in there. So that sounds like a for each loop to me for each domain in domain list. Thank God. We're going to do that. And that should create our dropdown. I'm sorry, once again, model.domainList. And once again, I also forgot to make this a form control. So let's go ahead and run this now that there's no errors and see what this looks like, just to make sure that we did it right. And then we'll get into the nitty-gritty bullshit. Horse fuck, that is. Oh, come on, what happened here? Cannot parse the JSON file. What did I do? What did I do wrong here? I must have done something wrong here. Are there too many closing parentheses, braces? Probably. Or there's not enough. There we go, there wasn't enough. My bad. So let's go ahead and restart the project. This is why we test things. It's very important to test things. Error while validating the service type. Scoped implementation. Unable to resolve. What? 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 auto-resolve service for type HTTP context accessor. The fuck did I do wrong? Wah, wah, wah. Okay, I fixed it. The reason why that was happening was I needed to actually also add the service HTTP context accessor. The reason why this took me off guard was because in my test project, I'm adding other services that in turn add this, like add identity, which we're going to get to in the next episode. So if you're not adding other services that need this, then you'll have to add this yourself. It's not a big deal. That's how you can add it. So anyway, back to our page here. Let's go ahead and go to /auth, and you can see we have our domain drop down, we have our username, and we have our password. If I don't put a password in, we get an error. If I put a password in, nothing happens because we didn't write that part of it. Perfect. Okay, so let's go ahead and finish writing our authentication page real quick. So what we want to do is we want to say authresolver.authenticate, and we want to pass in the domain, the username, and the password. And we're going to need to await this. So we're going to say result equals await that. And then if result.success, we're good. Else, fuck you. If there's an error, we want to say error equals result.error. And if we're good, then I think at that point we just return redirect to page. And we'll send them to the account page. And we can just put this up in here. So let's go ahead and make sure this all works. It's not going to authenticate us because I didn't write any of the authentication code yet, but I should at least get the error now. And we should see it in our beautiful Bootstrap alert view component that we created. So blah, blah. And there we go. We didn't write it yet. Perfect. Okay, so now let's get to the nitty-gritty. And it also just occurred to me that I can clean this up by using generics here, so I will just clean this up briefly. There we go. That looks a little prettier. All right, so let's get to our authentication code, right? So instead of we didn't write it yet, the first thing we need to do is we need to determine if we're doing a selectable authentication or if we're going to try everything. So we're going to call this selectable auth versus cascade auth, where we're going to cascade through all the providers, right? So if we're going to cascade, then what we want to do is we want to say for each var provider name in authconfig providers. You know, we should probably also make a check here. We should probably say if authconfig.providers.count is 0, then return auth result. No authentication providers configured. Just in case someone deletes that entire chunk of the config file. So if we're going to go through all the authenticate, we're going to create a function basically called authenticate with. And we're going to pass in the provider name, which at this point is just the domain name, the username, and the password. So if they select it, if it's, you know, if their administrator has them selecting a domain, then we just want to authenticate with that domain. And if we're going to cascade, then we're going to do this for each domain that's in the providers list. So we're going to create a reference to, we're going to create a list of errors, which is going to be a string builder, because we're going to, you know, if someone gets through all the providers and they can't log in, that means that they don't have, you know, they failed login on every single domain that's configured. So we want to be able to provide them a list of errors so that they understand why. So we're going to say var result equals await authenticate with. Instead of the domain name, we're going to say prov name and the username and the password. And then we're going to say if they succeeded, so if they actually logged in to one of these, then we're just going to return that result. Otherwise, we're going to move on to the next one. Well, let's append the error result dot, let's do it like this, result dot error with a new line at the end, so that we just get like this line separated list of why they couldn't log in. And if they can't log in, so all providers failed, then we're going to return a new auth result with the list of errors. And now we just got to write our authenticate with. So public async task of auth result authenticate with, and we're going to take the provider name, the username, and the password. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to check for internal authentication, because that's not actually an Active Directory domain. So if the provider name is null, or the provider name, do a case insensitive comparison to internal, then we're going to do internal authentication, which we're going to do on our next episode. So for now, we're just going to say not implemented. But anything else is going to be an Active Directory domain authentication. So first, we're going to make sure that we actually have the provider that was selected. Because again, just because they're selecting this from a drop-down menu doesn't mean that this provider name could never be anything else. Because number one, you could easily edit an HTML page, or you could use JavaScript to submit the form with some arbitrary value in there. And number two, maybe we changed the menu while the user had the page loaded. So we need to check to make sure that this provider actually exists. So we'll say if the auth config dot providers, if it doesn't contain this key, then we're going to return an error and say unknown auth provider. Just to make sure that we have it. And then we're going to go ahead and grab the AD configuration for that provider. So that's auth config. What is the issue here? Oh, this is domains, not providers. Providers is a string array. And also I misspelled contains. So we're going to do auth config.domains, pass in the provider name, and now we should have the configuration object for that Active Directory domain. And then we're going to go ahead and there's going to be a new function we're going to create in our auth class called ADAuth. And we're going to give it the Active Directory configuration, the provider name, the username, and the password. And that's where all of the real AD interoperability is going to happen. So we're going to go ahead and write this now. I'm going to go all the way up here to my beautiful authentication class. What is this? Is this awaitable? This is awaitable? Well, let's go ahead and wait it then. Await it then. Oh yeah, because we made it awaitable here. Duh. Okay, so let's go ahead and create this public static async task of auth result called ADAuth, which is going to take an AD configuration, a string, which is the provider name. At this point, it's the domain name because it's AD. And we're going to accept the username, and we're going to accept the password. And I think I forgot to await that down here. And I did. We have to await that. Perfect. Now we're going to actually get into the Active Directory interoperability here. So we're going to actually need to add 2 NuGet I did not mean to fucking click View in Browser. I clicked build. We're going to add some NuGet packages. The first one we need to add is called Microsoft.Windows Compatibility. And the reason it's called compatibility is because these are Windows specific classes that are not included with ASP.NET Core. ASP.NET Core is cross-platform, so if we were to use these classes on a Linux system, they would fail. Now that's fine because most people running this on Linux are not going to be using Active Directory, so we just got to wrap it in a try-catch block just to make sure that we don't get a not supported exception. But we're going to go ahead and include that so that we can talk to AD. And the other one that we want to add is called Anti-XSS, which is a encoding library that helps you avoid cross-site scripting attacks, and you'll see why we need this in a second. Tra-la-la. All right, now we're going to actually write the function that authenticates to AD. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make sure the admin actually provided configuration for this shit. So we're going to say if the config.hostname is null or the config.basedn is null, then we just can't do anything. So we're going to return new auth result. We're going to say domain is not properly configured. Okay, makes sense. We're going to go ahead up here and we're going to import the system.directory services namespace as well as the, I think it's system.security.application. No, Microsoft security application. Microsoft.security.application, which is where the anti-cross-site scripting shit lives. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a root directory entry, which is going to represent the root of Active Directory. Directory entry. And it's going to start off with a URL, which is LDAP : config hostname port number, config.port / and then config basedn. And then we're going to take the user's credentials and we're going to connect to AD using those credentials. We don't need to have a service account. We don't need any kind of baked-in credential to talk to AD. We're going to what's called bind, in other words, authenticate to the LDAP server as the user that's authenticating to us. So we're just going to pass their credentials straight through. And if it fails, well, then their credentials are wrong. And if it succeeds and connects, then we're going to use that connection to actually pull the data about that user from the directory. So we're going to wrap everything here in a big try-catch block for two reasons. The first of which is any of this shit could fail. If the domain is unavailable, if their password is wrong, if anything happens, then it's going to fail and we're going to want to return the error. But the other reason is that, like I mentioned before, this functionality is only going to run under Windows. So if someone tries this on Linux, it's also going to fail and return, this operation is not available on your platform message. Either way, we're going to return that back to the user. I'm just going to return the exception message back to them. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create what's called an LDAP filter, which is how we're going to figure out what it is in the directory we want to grab. So we're going to do a logical and we're going to have two clauses in here. The first is that we're looking for a user, and the second is we're looking for a user with that specific username that they typed in. And in Active Directory, the username attribute is called SAM account name for legacy reasons. Now, we can't just put username in here like this. The reason for that is, let's say someone typed in a username that looks something like this. Right parenthesis and then open parenthesis and then some more shit. Like, they could easily inject LDAP queries or criteria into here that we were not anticipating. So we really don't want them to be able to type, like, for example, a right parenthesis or a left parenthesis. There's a couple different characters we don't want them to type. So instead of just putting username right in here like a newbie, we're going to use encoder.LDAP encode username, and that's going to escape any special characters they use. The other reason for this is maybe there is a right parenthesis character in there. Actually, this is going to be LDAP Filter encode. Maybe there is a right parenthesis character in their username. Windows allows for that. Windows allows for a lot of crazy shit that you would not expect. Usernames can have spaces in them. They can have apostrophes in them. I've seen it all. So we definitely want to encode anything that we're baking into our filter here. So next thing we're going to do is we're going to create what's called a directory searcher. And this does exactly what you'd expect. It searches the directory. So it takes two parameters that we care about: the root of the directory that we want to search down, and the filter that we want to search for. And then there's a function on here called find one. So we're just going to find, there's only going to be one user with the SAM account name. So either there's no user or there is a user. And if there's no user, we're never going to get to this point because this is going to fail. It won't even connect if the user doesn't exist in the directory. So essentially, if we get to this point, we know that the username they provided is at least valid. So now we're just looking for their user account so that we can grab the properties off of it, like the email address, the title, the group membership, all that good shit. But let's just say it can't find it for some reason. We're going to go ahead and return new auth result. Just say login failed. We don't need to be really specific about what happened here. Now at this point, we know that their login succeeded, so let's create a new auth result. And in here we're going to say success is true. And I'm going to go ahead, before I continue on, I'm going to go ahead down here. This is a static class, so I'm going to create an extension method here called getString. And I'm going to take in a search result and a property name. And the reason I'm doing this is because the logic that you use to get a value off of an AD user account is roundabout in C#. So I'm going to make an extension method. I'm actually going to make two that make this easy because we're going to need to grab a bunch of properties off of here. So what we're going to do is we're going to say if r.properties prop name, or if it doesn't contain the property name that we're looking for, like in other words, we're looking for an email address and there's no email address on that account, then we're going to return null. Otherwise, we want to return properties indexed by property name, then indexed by 0.toString. And the reason for this convolution is that in Active Directory, attributes or properties or whatever you want to call them can be multi-valued. Now, a user account is only going to have one username, and a user account is only going to have one email address. But when we get into things like group memberships or certain other attributes that we might want to put in later, there might actually be more than one value. So the syntax for this actually requires an index. So we're going to go ahead and do that. What is the issue here? This has to be static. That's what the issue is. And we're also going to create a getString array. I don't even think we need getString array. Let's ignore it for now. So let's go back up here, and we're going to say username equals r. See, now we can do getString, and I can just put in the property that I want, SAM account name. It's case insensitive, but I like to get it correct. We also want to grab their distinguished name, which in LDAP, at least in Active Directory, is called distinguished name. We want their email address, which is under the mail property. We want their title, again, if they have one. If not, this is just going to be null. And we also, finally, we want their display name, which is under display name. All right. So at this point, need a semicolon. At this point, I could just return result. But we still have to worry about our roles, right? We have to deal with our roles and our groups, our group membership to role mappings, right? Actually, the other thing that we also do need to return is an auth type. So I'm actually just going to provide the domain name as the auth type. Perfect. So now let's look up the groups that the user is in. There's a couple different ways to do this. There's an attribute called member of that we could easily read in. It's one of those multi-valued properties that I was talking about, but it's not an array of group names. It's an array of distinguished names or pointers to the groups. So that's not going to help. Oh my God, I misspelled distinguished name. Distinguished name. Jesus, that would have been interesting. I probably wouldn't have even noticed. So instead of pulling the groups off of the user, we're actually going to search for the groups. And if we want to look for nested groups, in other words, Bob is in sales and sales is in wiki editors, then this is really the only way to do that. So we're going to do, first we're going to create a new list of string to capture the roles that we're going to put the user in. And before we return, we're going to say result.roles equals roles.toArray. So we're going to shove that into our return, our auth result before we return it. And now we're actually going to figure out what groups the user is in. So what we're going to do next really depends on whether or not nested groups are enabled or not. So if nested groups are not enabled, then our filter is going to be pretty simple. So real quick, in LDAP terms, this is a logical AND. I know it looks like a pair of tits, but each of these parentheses is one criteria, one piece of criteria, one search term, and both of these have to be true in order for this to match something. So just like before, we're going to search on object category. This time it's going to be group instead of user. And then what we're going to do is we're going to look for member equals, and we're going to put in a reference to our user here. So just like before, I'm not going to bake their distinguished name directly in. I'm going to use encoder.LDAP filter encode, and we're just going to do result.dn because we already got the distinguished name up here. So this is going to search for any group in which this user is a member, and that's how we're going to get our list of groups. Now, if we're looking for nested groups, it's pretty much the same thing. Some people would write some really fucking convoluted logic to get the list of groups and then look inside of all of those groups and recursively. That makes login take for fucking ever. Active Directory is smarter than that. It already knows what expansive list of groups someone is in. So there's a much easier way to do that. And that is using this chunk of seemingly arbitrary nonsense here. So what this actually is, it's called a well-known OID operator. So just like LDAP has equals, and it has greater than or equals, and it has not, and or, this is a custom operator that Microsoft baked into Active Directory like 30 years ago, and it's called matching rule in chain. And essentially means we want every group that either contains this user as a member or contains a group that has this user as a member, and so on and so forth, and Scooby-Dooby-Dooby. And you can use this operator when you're looking up like management chains. Like you could do manager, and if I change this to user, this would get every manager and manager's manager that is a manager of this user. And you could do it for direct reports, you could do it for member of, you can do it for anything where the value of the attribute is going to be another object that has the same attribute, and so on. So that is how we are going to look up nested groups. Anyway, now that we have a filter, we're going to create a new directory searcher. Still looking at the root, we're going to use the new filter. And this time, instead of doing find one, we're going to say, let's just say group results equals find all. And this is going to find any groups, might be none, might be a couple, might be hundreds, that the user is in. And then we're going to for each over them. So we're going to look at all the search results. We'll call it G in group results. So when we get to here, this loop is going to run for every group that comes back from Active Directory. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to grab the group name. So use our handy dandy get string. And unlike username, the name of a group is just name. Makes it really fucking easy. And then the next thing we need to do, so actually let's make a comment here. Runs once for each group the user is in. I don't typically write comments within the middle of a function, but in this case, you know, this group logic can get kind of hard to read, especially for someone that doesn't understand LDAP. So, and the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to say, you know, actually, this whole entire fucking thing here is only meaningful if we have group role mappings. So if config.group role mappings is not null, then do all of this. We don't even care what groups the user is in if the administrator doesn't care. If everyone that's in the directory is going to be a regular user, then we can save some time and not even do this lookup. But now we know that group role mappings is there, so we can say if group role mappings does not contain this group name as a key, then continue, because it's a group that we don't care about. And if it does, then let's go ahead and get the name of the role that we want. So config group role mappings group name. And now role is the role that we care about, and we can just add it to roles. And that's pretty much it. I think we've done everything that we need to do. I'm going to go back into our authentication page here. And one thing I forgot to do is authenticates the user, but it doesn't actually log them in. It doesn't apply that to their session. So we do need to do auth.login and pass in the HTTP context and the result. And this is awaitable, so we need to await it. And now we're good. I forgot a semicolon, but I think we have it. All right, so let's run it and see if we didn't fuck anything up. So we're gonna log in. First thing I'm gonna do is try internal, because it should fail and say that it's not implemented, and it does. Now we're gonna go ahead and try to log in. I'm gonna use my real password. Well, actually, let's try an invalid password first. Boom, the username or password is incorrect. That's a good sign. And I'll use my correct password. And what do you know? Oh, what the fuck happened here? That's not right. That's not right. Let's see. I'm sure you were screaming at me when I did it wrong, but let's see what I did wrong here. Oh, you know what? I know what I did wrong. Email. Title. Display name. The dangers of copying and pasting. As usual. 80% of coding errors are for copying and pasting and forgetting to change something. I don't even know that static analysis could have helped out there. So let's do it again. Obviously it's working because it let me in. Oop. Try that again. There we go. So got my name, which is my username. My DN is my DN, my email address, my title, my display name. And it picked up that I'm an admin because I'm in the, here I will show you if I pull open my account. I got a member of, I am in Wiki admins. Now let's go ahead and try a different user account. Let's try the other domain. We'll try our Bob account. Unknown auth provider, other. What did we do wrong? What did we do wrong? Let's take a look at our, whatever the fuck it's called, app settings.json. How did we fuck this up? Oh, you know what? Earlier when I missed a fucking closing brace, when I had an extra one, that's where it went. Haha. See why it's important to put those error checks in there? Because someone is gonna fuck up the configuration. Someone is gonna fuck up the configuration. 100%. Good news is that I should just literally be able to just try it immediately, because our auth resolver service is scoped, which means that it reloaded the configuration as soon as a new page request came in. And there we go, we're logged in. Title, loser, Bob is a loser, and he is an editor because I put him in the Wiki editors group. So let's see if nested groups is working properly. I'm gonna go ahead and create a group called sales. And in that group, we're gonna add Bob. And in our member of, we're gonna make him an admin. Wiki admins, and then we're going to remove Bob. Let's find Bob again. Let's remove Bob from Wiki editors. And now, if we log Bob in on the derms domain, he should have no roles other than user. But if we log him in on the other domain, he should have the admin role, because we have if you remember, we had nested group set to true there. So let's go ahead and try that. So let's log Bob in on derms. And sure enough, he only has a user role. And now let's log Bob in on other. And there you go, admin. Perfect. This is working beautifully. That takes us to the end of the video. I know it was a long one. On the next video, we're actually going to get into ASP.NET Core Identity, which is actually storing the users, the roles, their password hashes, all their identity information in the application database, so that you don't have to be an enterprise that has Active Directory. It's going to be what 99% of the people that want to run a wiki wind up using. It's not that difficult, as you'll see in the next episode, but I'm glad that we got this working. As always, if you think I fucked up, or you have any questions, or you want to know more about something, leave a comment below. If you like my video, you want to see more, you think it's going somewhere, whatever, like, subscribe, consider supporting me on Patreon, all that good shit. And until next time, stay safe, and I will see you. Bye.